Welcome to MMA Live TV. And can I just say that we've had an amazing 2020 so far when it comes to fights. Amazing 2020. I mean, we've had Jones versus Reyes, Corey versus Jan, Felder versus Hooker, the girls' fight, Israel Adesanya, even the fight in UFC Brasilia, Oliveira versus Kevin Lee. Amazing. Mucho bueno. I think that was Italian. I mean, I guess the short of it is we've had an amazing run of fights. Some of the best that we've seen throughout the course of UFC. Amazing momentum. And really what we saw was a lot of great fights coming in. I'd like to introduce a new segment in MMA Live TV called the MMA Roundup, where we'll go through just general MMA news and what's going on. I think the talk of the town at the moment is essentially the coronavirus, also known as COVID-19, and the implications that it's had from a sporting perspective. Obviously, as we know, the NBA is shut indefinitely. Soccer leagues have followed suit as well. It's an interesting time. Here in Australia, the NRL is actually banning audiences from round 2 onwards. So there'll be games will be played without audiences. It's an amazing time, and it's really brought into light actions from sporting organizations of the like that we haven't seen before. Enter the UFC, which if you think about any sort of fighting league, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, just merely due to the proximity of the individuals and the nature of fighting and the fact that you're in someone's grill and there's blood and there's sweat and all that good shit, makes it a germ magnet, right? Like in terms of for the fighters itself. So the UFC is not immune to this, and essentially when it was first announced of the COVID and the restrictions that we were having, and especially after the NBA brought to light and suspended their season, being the biggest North American league, we had Dana White, who's an extremely strong leader, came out, put up his stance and said, we will continue. The UFC will continue. They will figure it out. The Trump administration had basically a mandate to ensure that only you could have around 50 individuals within a gathering per se, and the UFC made it work. UFC Brasilia was the first UFC event ever had without an audience, and it was interesting. It was weird. It was like what you saw when Gilbert Burns finished Damian Maia. He got up and he yelled out, and usually you have the adoration of fans. It was definitely a different environment there. There's no doubt. When Charles Oliveira finished Kevin Lee, he was celebrating with his corner, but there was definitely a different environment. So look, fundamentally it was set aside by Dana White that they would mow through it and they'd keep and go through it. But I think the realities have caught up, and the Trump administration basically put up a new mandate where they could only put 10 individuals. And I think this was a sticking point for the UFC, and the fact that a UFC event was such a big logistical endeavor that you probably have more than 10 cornermen on both sides. They couldn't make it happen. And as a result, unfortunately, good old Dana, as he puts his head down, he's had to postpone. I mean, it's not cancelled, it's postponed, the next 3 events. And damn, what a shocker it's been, because these were 3 big events. I mean, on March 21st, you had Tyron Woodley versus Leon Edwards in UFC Fight Night 171. Oh my goodness, that was a cracker. That's a cracker of a fight, and essentially, in my mind, a fight that determines the winner of Usman and Masvidal. Really important fight that was going to be postponed. And obviously, Leon Edwards, based in the UK, he's been clamoring for a long while now to headline a fight and a fight card. And pity he couldn't get an actual UFC event. But the fact that this was cancelled is devastating, and I think for Tyron as well. The interesting tidbit that comes out of here is, Colby Covington comes in. He says that he wants to fight Tyron. And wow, this is an interesting fight if it goes through. And I think a more sellable fight, than Woodley and Edwards. Wow, talk about a switch up if this happens through. But to be announced, nothing's been announced. March 28th saw the UFC Ngannou versus Rosenstruck. Again, potentially a title eliminator for the number 1 contendership fight. Ngannou obviously being on a roll of last, and Rosenstruck with that KO, that vicious KO that he had with Overeem. I'm going to put a photo up here in terms of Overeem's lips. It was nasty, like buck nasty we're talking about. So a big fight there as well. A lot of these fights are are headlined by individuals that are potentially fighting for a number one contendership fight. So amazing. In April 11th, we saw Overeem versus Harris. So names, definitely big names, and like we were seeing some good momentum with a UFC event essentially back to back in the last couple of weeks. And mate, I bought the UFC Fight Pass, man. Like, what the hell? Come on, Dana, help a brother out. Nah, it's just joking. But you know what I'm saying, right? Like, it's a really interesting time. And how are they going to make these things up? Interestingly enough, April 18th sees, in my mind, the biggest fight in the last 2 years. Khabib versus Tony El Cucuy. I've lost my marbles, Ferguson. By the way, I'm all on the Ferguson train, so don't quote me out of context here. Tony, if you're watching, and I know you are, I'm on your side. Dana has gone on record saying this will happen even if it's not, and this is an interesting one, in the United States. These are the restrictions and these are the times. Obviously, like COVID-19 has brought a very real pandemic and a very real emotions with individuals, and obviously like we've seen the likes of Jon Jones, put up on his Twitter that it's that his mindset is not even on fighting at the moment, and I'm sure he's not the only one that shares these feelings, right? Like feelings of fear definitely cannot be ushered. Like, we are living in this environment, and it's really interesting to see moving forward what it's going to be. And I think, say what you want about Dana, he's a really strong leader, and I like that he led from the front and told what the direction, and strong leadership is what's required, especially for your sporting organization and league in times like this. But, there have been a lot of kickbacks on his end, with a lot of people saying that, he's essentially being financially greedy and not necessarily looking after his fighters and his fans. Look, it's a double-edged sword. You can think about it in a couple of different ways. I think, just like everything in life, you don't necessarily want these, any sort of event to dictate the way you live. But at the same time, there has to be a natural tendency to, take care of a sports league, to take care of its fighters, and B, its spectators. So the good thing about the UFC is, as a league, they're not necessarily overly dependent, upon gate ticket sales, right? Obviously, it's money and money that comes in, but pay-per-view, especially in the major events, are the draw cards. Essentially, fighters want to fight as well. I mean, you could talk about Edwards and Tyron. They were gunning to fight, and all these guys, I'm sure, were gunning to fight. You got to understand, from a fighter's perspective, they don't make money until they fight. You have a guaranteed contract for a period of fights, but you draw that check as you fight. And interestingly enough, in the case of some of these guys who would already have a fight camp, they've invested money. They've already paid for it. They've already started their fight camp. So it's potentially like a liquidity thing happening here. Interesting times, really interesting times. Only time will tell. Obviously, Tony versus Khabib has to happen. We can't have a pandemic stopping this. This, I can't even remember, 5, 7 times, whatever. This fight has been delayed time and time again. It has to happen. We got to see, Khabib to send the locations. Mate, this is such a big fight, and to have it not happen in North America is not the biggest thing, but where would you take it? Dagestan? Russia? Let's do it. Putin's up. I mean, he'd love it, right? No? Oh, it's amazing. Look, this has been the MMA Roundup by MMA Live TV. Leave some comments below. Tell us what you think about the cancellations. Tell us if you think, where you think Tony versus Khabib is going to be, and where does this take the UFC in terms of the coronavirus and the current pandemic. Do you agree with Dana White's stance? Talk to me, guys. Talk soon. Peace.